Hello everyone, it's Mark Goodacre here. Welcome to an extra extended episode of the NT Pod. Its topic is the Synoptic Problem. It's the first of three. It's simply a recording of a class that I recently gave at Duke University in my Introduction to the New Testament course. I've cut out certain things in the recording, especially, for example, people's questions which the microphone hadn't picked up. Hope you enjoy it, and if you'd like this kind of episode again, just let me know and I'll see what I can do.
Yeah? Okay, so what is the synoptic problem? Well, it all begins from a very simple observation, which is that you've got four Gospels, right? We're going to start with basics, absolute basics here. You've got four Gospels, yeah? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Three of those, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are called the Synoptic Gospels because you can look at them together. Because the syn bit in the synoptic means with or together. The optic bit means you can look at, yeah? So you can look at them together. Why can't you look at John alongside them? Because John's just a bit too different. There's one or two passages where you can. One or two passages where you can put John alongside those three and compare it directly. But lots and lots of the time, John is just too far removed from the synoptics. So the synoptics have their own special name. Yeah? From now on in the course, we will always talk about synoptics, just like we'll talk about pericopes and that type of thing. The midterm asks you to get familiar with passages in the synopsis, and here's an example of what a passage in the synopsis looks like. Now, there's at least three people who aren't here today, one because of the snow, another because of illness, and another because I'm guessing there's at least a third person not here. To those people, you have to look at this, point out your handout. Well, you do as well, but it's obvious that you do. And the passage is Matthew 9:9, Mark 2:14, and Luke 5:27. And this is an example of a synopsis. This is what a synopsis looks like. What you do is you line up the words in parallel to one another, in vertical columns like this, so that you can see how similar they are and how different they are. And this is a good example of one that's quite similar but quite different. What, in looking at it straight away, do you notice that's different? What's the big thing that's different? There. Because there's like, an and that's in a different place. Not that big a deal, is it? Right? But there's one big deal difference, isn't there? What's the big deal difference? Yeah? Right. Yeah. Yes. That's true, yeah. So very early on in Mark and much later on in Matthew, that's right, agreed. But that wasn't what I was thinking of. It's all right, though, it's good. I'm not one of those people that does those things where there's an expected answer, and if you don't get the expected answer, I go, no. It always annoys me that when you sit in class, and especially if your answer's better than the one that the professor's got. So, no. Who else? No, go on then. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Oh, right, another good one. No, that's another good one, yeah, but not what I was looking for. Right. That's what I was thinking of, yeah. The name of the man's different. So in Mark and Luke, he's called Levi, and in Matthew, he's called Matthew. And when we looked last time at the anonymity of the Gospels, actually it wasn't last time, it was the time before, wasn't it? We looked at the anonymity of the Gospels. I suggested that this might be one of the reasons that Matthew's Gospel got called Matthew's Gospel. That when he gets to this story, he calls this disciple Matthew. No, I don't really either. It's just to suggest, I don't know if you call that, it's confused why that would make people infer that it was Matthew. It may not be that. It may be nothing to do with it. But if you imagine someone, the theory is if you imagine someone reading Matthew's Gospel, not knowing who it's written by, and then they're thinking, well, are there any clues in the text? And then they say, well, Peter, James, and John, that's all the same, and Andrew, that's the same. Well, who's the next person called? Well, it's Matthew. Oh, Matthew tax collector. Oh, I wonder if it's because it's the author. And I think the theory that is that it's as simple as that. But yeah, you're right. It's not a very persuasive thing, is it? And it might have nothing to do with it. Yes. Yes, there is a disciple called Matthew. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and this is what's kind of odd. When Mark tells the story, he tells the story of this call of Levi, and you're thinking, oh, good, so we're ratcheting up the disciples. We've got Peter, James, John, Andrew, that's the first four. Now we've got Levi, and you're thinking, great, who's going to be next? No, there aren't any more. And then he lists the disciples, like you say, and Levi's not one of them. It's really strange. And that might be why Matthew, we call him Matthew, the writer of the first gospel, did what he did, because he thought, who's Levi? Never heard of him. Could be that. There's an even more curious phenomenon as well for the geeks, which is that, not just for the geeks, anyone that's interested, and that's that Mark calls him Levi, son of Alphaeus. And then when he lists the 12 disciples, there's someone called James, son of Alphaeus. So is that his brother? Is it Levi? Is it him? Is it his other name? And one thing this shows, I mean, when we do the Historical Jesus course, one of the things we look at is the fact that people kind of have forgotten the names of lots of the disciples by the time they're writing the Gospels. There's really little bit of uncertainty about it. There's even one disciple who is a textual variant, Lebbaeus, in Matthew's Gospel. I always feel sorry for him if he was a real person, you know, because he's just condemned forevermore to the footnotes of only a few texts. He's called Thaddeus otherwise, and Thaddeus isn't in Luke either. Luke has someone an extra Judas, so it's yeah, it's funny, they've forgotten that by the time the Gospels were being written, they'd pretty much forgotten who the disciples were, except for the main core people, I think. That's why you don't get them mentioned much. So that's a little example of what a synopsis looks like. It's just one short passage, and as we'll see in a bit, that passage is called triple tradition because it comes in 3 synoptics. But the similarities between the synoptics isn't just in the wording, it's also in the order of pericopes. So they often have a parallel order of events, and I've set out from Mark 8 all the way through to Mark 9 and shown you in columns how the order between Matthew, Mark and Luke runs parallel. That's just one little example. We could do lots more of it. And where you see little kind of blanks in Mark and Luke, or blanks in Matthew, even where one of Matthew and Luke drops what's in Mark, the other one still seems to keep in that same order. So Mark is consistent down that sort of middle column, as it were. Now, what this leads to, similarity in wording and similarity in order, is the startling conclusion that there must be some kind of literary relationship between the Synoptic Gospels. In other words, the Synoptic Gospels are not independent of one another. The similarities are simply too great, almost everyone thinks, for this to be the result of anything other than some kind of direct copying. And now it's kind of shocking, this is, because one of the things in our culture is that plagiarism is about the worst thing you can possibly do, isn't it? I mean, when you read the Duke guide on you must not plagiarize kind of thing, it's like the biggest sin imaginable, isn't it? Big crime. It's like almost as bad as murder kind of thing, isn't it? Plagiarism. And back in the day, not back in the 1970s and 80s, when people could copy out of books and not get caught, but back in the 1st century, you were allowed to copy, pretty much. No one would tell you off for it at all. It wasn't kind of something which you would try and do a lot. And in fact, some of the better authors wouldn't copy verbatim out of their sources. But it looks like someone or some people in the Synoptic Gospels has been doing some copying. And the Synoptic Problem is basically about who's been copying from who. So the Synoptic Problem aims to discover who's been copying from whom, a key historical question and a fascinating literary puzzle. And then in bold, the Synoptic Problem, this is the definition, is the study of the similarities and differences of the Synoptic Gospels in an attempt to explain their literary relationship. Every now and then, you'll get someone who will say, it's not a literary relationship, it can be explained by oral tradition and this sort of thing, and usually the people arguing it have not understood the problem properly. The classic book on this in recent years is Etta Linneman, who in 1992 wrote a book called Is There a Synoptic Problem? And the answer to that question is yes, and you cannot successfully explain it unless you've got borrowing by one evangelist from another. It's simply impossible. I think it's simply impossible to have that degree of similarity. Does anyone want to dispute that? I've just stated it, haven't I, in a bold way, and just hope that you'll go along with me. But I can promise you that it is true, because if you look at texts that we know are not dependent on one another, the degree of variation is just much, much bigger. The kind of agreement you get between the Synoptic Gospels is among some of the highest degrees of agreement that you can find in ancient texts. They're actually quite unusual, the degree of verbatim agreement that you've got. So fascinating to work out why. Why is that going on? So, number 2, different kinds of material. Most of the material in the Synoptic Gospels falls into one of 4 basic categories. Really easy to pick up. Triple tradition, double tradition, special Matthew, special Luke. We'll come to it. I mean, the thing about the Synoptic Problem is that there are some parts which most people think are direct copying. For example, as we'll see, a lot of people think that Matthew and Luke copied directly out of Mark. That's the most common theory, so it's direct copying. Is that kind of thing you mean? Yeah. And also, many people think that Matthew and Luke copied directly from another source now lost called Q. So one of the dimensions of the question, which we will come to, is what kind of copying are we talking about? Are we talking of mutual knowledge of documents now lost, or direct copying from one another? That is one of the big questions. Like one big uber-gospel. Yeah, gospel. Yeah, they could. And that was a big theory for a long time in synoptic studies, that there was one big original gospel. But it actually doesn't make as good sense of the data as the prevailing theories do. Good question. There definitely has been at least some convergence. There's a phenomenon when you look at the different texts of the Gospels called harmonization. And what will happen is a scribe is copying out something in Mark, but he's more familiar with the version in Matthew. So subconsciously, or possibly even consciously sometimes, he starts changing it and making it like Matthew's wording. Absolutely, that happens a lot. One of the questions is, how much does it happen? You know, does it happen? And one of the great fun things about textual criticism is doing this and working out how far that kind of thing's happened. On the whole, it hasn't happened so much that we can't do synoptic problem studies, but it's happened enough to make doing synoptic problem studies difficult, because you have to keep saying, well, did Matthew really write that? Or did Luke really write that? Or did a scribe add it? Yeah. So you've got 4 different kinds of material. Let me just interrupt myself again one more time. I do rudely do that sometimes, interrupt myself. But sometimes when I look at the way that other people teach the synoptic problem, they don't actually teach the synoptic problem. And if you look at introductions to the New Testament and introductions to the synoptic problem, they often don't introduce the synoptic problem. What they do is they introduce you to one of the solutions to the problem and then arrange the data around the solution. Bad teaching, bad method, in my opinion. You must introduce, first of all, the problem in order that you can then work out what the solution is. And it's a kind of disappointing fact of the way that the synoptic problem gets taught, that people just get introduced straight away to a solution, and then they get the facts all arranged around that solution, rather than having the problem set out. So that's why I'm doing this. I'm explaining to you what the problem actually is. Okay? So anyway, continuing what the actual problem is, 4 different kinds of data, broadly speaking. Triple tradition, double tradition, special Matthew and special Luke. The nice thing is that they're all really straightforward categories. What's in triple tradition? Stuff that's in 3 Gospels, right? Matthew, Mark and Luke. What's in double tradition? Stuff that's in 2. Matthew and Luke. What's special Matthew? Stuff that's special to Matthew. What's special Luke? Stuff that's special to Luke. It's like going back to elementary school, this, isn't it? Coloured pencils as well. This could be the easiest course at Duke, couldn't it?
There's nothing in Mark that's not in the other 2.
Very little. There's very little special Mark. Yeah, well picked up. Yeah, there's very little special Mark. One piece of special Mark is a piece where there's a young man in the Garden of Gethsemane where Jesus is being arrested, and he runs away naked. It's in Mark 14. And it's not in Matthew and Luke. And just to anticipate one of our conclusions, one of the interesting things is that because the special Mark and material is all a bit odd like that, it tends to be easier to imagine how someone would omit that stuff than add it. But that's just to go ahead of ourselves a little bit. But yes, there's very little special Mark. There's some, but there's nowhere near as much as there is special Matthew and special Luke. There's loads of special Matthew and special Luke. Triple tradition is a huge category, and within triple tradition is contained a lot of what is in Mark's Gospel. And it has loads of things that any of you who know the Gospels, and I'm not taking it for granted that all of you do, but those of you that do know the Gospels will instantly know some triple tradition. The feeding of the 5,000, the parable of the sower, the call of the disciples. I mean, loads and loads of the most famous pieces of Gospel literature are in triple tradition. Much of Mark's Gospel's there. And broadly speaking, and one of the things about studying the synoptic problem is that we have to deal in overgeneralizations a lot of the time and oversimplifications. Broadly speaking, there's more narrative than there are sayings. And that could be a significant fact, as we'll come to find. Now, I've given you another piece of triple tradition on the next side of the handout. This is Matthew 8:25 to 26, and parallel. It's not the whole story of the stilling of the storm, but it's a bit of the story of the stilling of the storm. You get a feel again there for what a piece of triple tradition looks like. Just glancing at this piece so we can get familiar with the idea of looking at a synopsis. Any ideas of interest there? I mean, take a moment to sort of glance at it. One of them I'll point out while you're looking at it. The last line in Matthew, "O ye of little faith." Do you know that phrase? Yeah? Do you hear people saying that? It's one of the phrases that you get in the synoptics, which has gone into general everyday parlance. You know, people will say, "Oh, ye of little faith." You know, I mean, it's one of those little things people say. It's actually very, very, very much a characteristic of Matthew's Gospel. He's the one that likes saying, it's in Greek, it's oligopisto, ye of little faith. Mark never has it. Luke just has it once. Very common in Matthew. It's a case of, it's almost like Mark seems to take his view of the disciples always a little bit further than the others do. So notice how in Mark they have no faith. Matthew, little faith. In Luke, where is your faith? But notice how harsh the view of the disciples is in Mark. Any other matters of interest when you look at similarities and differences? Now you've had a chance to look.
I think it's interesting that the disciples address Jesus differently.
Yes, isn't it? Yeah, yeah. And you know Luke's address there, where it says Master, Master, epistata, epistata in Greek. That's doubly characteristic of Luke, not only because he likes to have Jesus addressed as epistata, Master. Only Luke has him addressed that way. But also the doubled vocative. If you know the story of the conversion of Paul, it happens there. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Or the story of Mary and Martha. Martha, Martha, you're worried and busy about many things. Or Simon Peter, Simon, Simon, Satan has sifted you. So, again, characteristic of Luke. And in fact, what you're already doing when you're doing this is exactly the kind of things I want you to do in your midterm. You're doing source criticism. You're looking at the text and you're going, that's different. I wonder why it's different. And that's at the heart of critical study of the Synoptic Gospels. Other pieces of interest there. Yeah. Yeah, it does. It looks harsh, doesn't it, in Mark? Yeah, yeah. The disciples in Mark's Gospel are quite brusque. You know, they're quite rude to Jesus. And a lot of people think, as I've already hinted, I've said it and I've hinted it, lots of people think Matthew and Luke use Mark's Gospel. And one of the things that people will see here, on the theory that Mark is the first Gospel, is the idea that Matthew and Luke look at Mark and they go, I don't quite like that. I'll adjust it, I'll smooth it over, make him a little bit less harsh towards the disciples. Yeah? So that you get that in a big way. There's a word that's just in Mark, around about the middle, which is really weird. It's my own translation, so I've deliberately used a sort of a slightly literalistic translation so that it comes through. Yes, be muzzled. What might that suggest? It's a strange thing to say, isn't it? Be silent, be muzzled. What does that suggest about the stilling of the storm, what Jesus is doing? What kind of thing do you muzzle? Right, dogs and that, right. So is Jesus in Mark's Gospel personifying the storm as some kind of beast that needs muzzling? It looks like it. It looks like he's treating it as a kind of beast. And that kind of fits with quite a lot of ancient ideas of storms and so on, that there is some kind of satanic beast or a leviathan or monster or a dragon or something in there that needs muzzling, right? And so Mark, in his gospel, all the way through, sees the whole thing as a kind of battle between Jesus and Satan, or Jesus and the demons. So right from early on, he gets tempted by the devil in Mark 1, 12 and 13. And then throughout the gospel, he battles away with demons and so on. Even when he's in nature like this, being muzzled, he sees the whole world as a kind of war between Jesus and the unclean spirits. To some extent, you get it in Matthew and Luke as well, but not as much, not as intensely as you get it in Mark's gospel. So that's an example of triple tradition. I mentioned as well that you've got, and that's loads and loads and loads of the synopsis. If you get yourself a copy of the synopsis and turn it over, loads of it is this triple tradition stuff. Loads of it is. Then you get to a smaller category. It's about 200 or 250 or so verses, which is called double tradition. Now, as I said, this is really simple because it means it's in two of the Gospels, and the two Gospels it's in is Matthew and Luke. I do have to explain, however, that there is some stuff that is in just Matthew and Mark and Luke, and that's not called double tradition. In fact, that hasn't got a name. But most people don't even know it's there because they don't actually read the synopses. And in fact, when I was writing my little book, I thought, oh gosh, what should we call it? And I looked across all the other books I could find in the Synoptic Problem. No one knows what to call it. And the thing is, the problem is with that stuff, the stuff that's just in Matthew and Mark and just in Mark and Luke, is it always appears in the Markan order. And so it seems quite different from this stuff, this double tradition, where Mark is largely absent. Now, double tradition is particularly curious for all sorts of reasons. One of them is that very often the double tradition material is really, really close. Verbatim identity across a whole passage, sometimes almost 100% agreement. And I've given you this as an example. If you were to colour this passage in the synopsis, and to use the colouring scheme that I use, this would be all green, because I have Matthew as blue and Luke as yellow. So this would be all green, bar about one word. Can any of you quickly spot the one word? Presume and begin. That's the only difference in the passage. Do not presume to say to yourself, we have Abraham as father, or do not begin to say to yourself. So really, really close. These are the words of John the Baptist. And this reveals something else about double tradition material, is that a lot of it is sayings material. Not all of it, but a lot of it is sayings material. And this material is also called, by some scholars, Q material, the Q material. And the reason they call it the Q material is that the solution that they offer to this problem is that there was a document now lost called Q. And so they use this as a term to describe the material. I don't like that, because if you happen to disagree with the theory, and who's to say where I come down on this issue, if you happen to disagree with the theory, then you don't want to describe the data using the terminology of the theory, do you? I mean, let's say, for example, that I had written a book which argued against the existence of Q. I wouldn't want to call the double tradition material Q material, would I? You're thinking, I'm bothered, you just call it what you want. Well, I'll tell you, it's called double tradition, okay? In this class, yeah? Excellent. Okay, so that's the end of page 3 of the handout. We're going to get down to the end of 3 and then we'll have a 5-minute break, okay? In case you're wondering, when is it going to stop? Okay, 2 other kinds of material. Special Matthew and Special Luke. Self-explanatory. Special Matthew is the stuff that's just in Matthew. Special Luke is the stuff just in Luke. Each category has some really famous material in it. Special Matthew includes the parable of the 10 virgins, the parable of the sheep and the goats. It's rich in general, Special Matthew is, with parables. Matthew likes his parables. It is largely sayings material, but not entirely. One of the most bizarre pieces of narrative you've got in there is the story of the coin in the fish's mouth in Matthew 17. Really, really great and bizarre story. And one of the curiosities about M material, as it's also called, is that sometimes you'll find this M material embedded in triple tradition material. So there's one piece of M, for example, is Pontius Pilate's wife has a dream when Pontius Pilate is examining Jesus, is trying Jesus, and Pontius Pilate's wife sends this message and says, don't have anything to do with this man, he's innocent, right? That's a little bit of M material. It's only in Matthew, but in Matthew it's embedded in the triple tradition story. Now, Luke sometimes has that in his L material, his special Luke material, but not quite so often. The L material is more often freestanding. The L material is rich in stories. Luke is a fine storyteller, and the L material has more interesting stories than almost any other piece of narrative. You will probably know at least a couple of them. One of the most famous is the Good Samaritan. Who hasn't heard of the parable of the Good Samaritan? Exactly. And you're not going to admit it when I put the question like that if you haven't. It's one of the most famous parables, and it's lent its name to organisations like Samaritans and so on. And that's in L material, Luke 10, 25, 37. It's Luke material. Same with parable of the prodigal son in Luke 15. In Luke 15, parable of the prodigal son, one of the most famous stories anywhere in the Gospels. It's only in Luke. There's something very slightly similar in Matthew. It lasts for only a couple of verses and is completely unmemorable. But Luke's is highly memorable. And it's parables and stories. Both of those things you have lots of in Luke's special material. The Gospel ends with a piece of L material of probably the most beautiful story anywhere in the Gospels, the story of the road to Emmaus, where two disciples are walking, distraught, with their heads hanging down. And then suddenly they realize they're walking with Jesus, who talks to them, and it's the resurrected Jesus. And they gradually come to a recognition of who he is through the sharing of the Eucharist, the Last Supper. They come to realize that Jesus is still with them. It's a brilliant story. And again, it's Luke material, special Luke, L material. So that's basically all of our categories. Now, because we have to oversimplify, I've said that most material can go into those four categories. I've already alluded to the fact that there are some complications, like the fact that you have some material that's just Mark and Luke, some that's just Matthew and Mark. We also have lots of stuff that crosses the categories. So, for example, you've got some stuff which is a kind of weird halfway mix between double tradition and triple tradition, where it's partly triple tradition, and then suddenly you get big insertions of double tradition into it. The best example of that is the temptation story, where Mark in 1, 12 and 13 just has this couple of verses of a kind of skeleton version of the story, but then Matthew and Luke have a whole massive extra bit, dialogue between Jesus and Satan. So that's what some scholars call Mark Q overlap, or mixture between double tradition and triple tradition. So I just mention that to say that the categories aren't as hard and fast as I've presented them, and you have to be aware of that as a problem, but don't get obsessed with it. That's more for the nerds, the number 3, yeah? Okay, right, shall we have a 5-minute break, and then we'll pick up on one of the really key pieces of data after that. So, right, synoptic problem, we've done all of the categories, and now we're going to do the most important fact of all. Now, most New Testament scholars don't know this fact. They've just been taught the standard solution to the problem, and they don't really know why they believe it. It's just that they've been taught it. But the most key fact about the synoptic problem is this, that Mark is the middle term amongst the synoptics. Usually. You always have to put in a usually, often, that kind of thing, little riders, and because with a synoptic problem, and it's why it drives some people to insanity, there's always little exceptions to the rule. But anyway, Mark is the middle term. It's the most important fact. Now, what does this actually mean? Well, we've seen some of it already. When we looked at that column of the order of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you noticed that Mark is the consistent point between Matthew and Luke. So if Matthew kind of adds something or Luke omits something, Mark is still the consistent thread going through. In terms of order, in other words, it is very unusual for Matthew and Luke to agree against Mark in order, right? They don't usually agree against Mark in order. And that must be significant. There is some sense in which Mark is the mediating gospel, the common denominator between the other two. So that double tradition material that we were just looking at, the stuff that's in just Matthew and Luke and not in Mark, that material usually appears outside of the Markan sequence. It's usually in its own special kind of order. I have to keep saying usually because I'm so conscious of the exceptions, but usually that's how it works. It's then not just the case with the order, though, because when you look at the specific wording in the triple tradition, you will often find that Matthew and Luke, their own agreements and wording, are mediated via Mark. In other words, where Matthew and Luke agree with one another, they are usually also agreeing with Mark, right? Most of the time, the major agreements between Matthew and Luke are mediated via Mark, in wording as well as order. Does that make sense? I tried to kind of draw this in my little book, Way Through the Maze, by showing that you would either have Matthew, Mark and Luke all together, or Mark and Luke, or Matthew and Mark. But you would rarely get Matthew and Luke when it comes to those things of sequence of order and wording within the triple tradition. And this has to be a significant fact. Mark is in some way a mediating term. Do you like my little bit of italics here? In other words, where all three synoptics are present in a given periscope. Oh, it does say periscope. Honestly, that's a genuine mistake. Not an intentional one. Excellent. I'm quite pleased about that. Does yours also say periscope as well, or is it just mine? Excellent. So, and it's in italics, so it must be right. Where all three synopses are present in a given periscope, Mark is usually the common denominator. That should say pericope. So, how do we explain that? So have you got that? Have I said it enough times? Sometimes, occasionally professors talk about teaching methods. And they don't talk about them enough, actually. But I've got a really brilliant teaching method, right? And it's called repetition. What you do, the heart of this method, is you just say the same thing lots of times, but in slightly different words, until it's gone in. And I don't stop saying it until I've got a kind of click of recognition. So just to stop me saying it one more time, have we all got Mark as the middle term? Brilliant. Excellent. Okay, so how do we explain that Mark is usually the middle term between the three synoptics? Well, most people think, the vast majority of scholars, that this phenomenon is explained by something called the priority of Mark, that Mark is the first gospel and that Matthew and Luke copied out of Mark. So that Mark, if you like, is forming the backbone of their gospels. Mark is the gospel that they are placing right at the centre of their thinking, as it were. They're, if you like, taking over Mark and producing fresh versions of his work. One of the questions I used to like to set on exams is Matthew's Gospel a second edition of Mark? And it's always a good one to get people thinking. Because people would say, on the one hand it is, but on another hand it's not. You know, it was one of those essay answers, exam answers. So priority of Mark is that Matthew and Luke both copied Mark. And what we're going to do next time, this isn't me finishing, I'm just previewing. What we're going to do next time is we're going to look at why people think that the priority of Mark is the best explanation. Because the alternative, or the primary alternative in the literature of the recent 2, 3, 4 decades, is the posteriority of Mark, which you can tell is less plausible than the priority of Mark because it's much harder to say. And the thing is, people who say it, they don't say posteriority of Mark because they know that will never catch on. But I say posteriority of Mark because the alternative, main alternative in the literature, is that Mark is not first but third. And that what happened is Mark got Matthew and Luke's Gospels in front of him and conflated them. And so Mark as a middle term is deliberately constructed by Mark himself. Mark effectively says, what we're going to do is we're going to get the bits where Matthew and Luke agree and stick them in this nice sort of shorter, more dramatic kind of gospel. And it's called, this theory is the Griesbach theory, or the Griesbach hypothesis. It's a little bit, I was just saying posteriority of Mark is one of those things that kind of doesn't sound that attractive. Griesbach sounds even less attractive, doesn't it? It sounds like, got a greasy back. That sounds horrible, doesn't it? And I'm extremely lucky that the theory that I subscribe to is called the Farrer theory, which sounds much nicer, doesn't it, than Griesbach. But Griesbach is important because he was the first person who actually gathered together a synopsis of the Gospels, of these kind we've been looking at. Up until Griesbach, what tended to happen is people just did harmonies of the Gospels. They would always harmonize the different Gospel accounts together. They would try and find ways of making the different Gospel accounts cohere with one another. What Griesbach did, though, in 1776, what Griesbach did is he said, I'm going to put the Gospels in synopsis so we can compare and contrast. And it was a brilliant step forward, and it was a fantastic thing that Griesbach did. But having done it, like anybody, and like you were already doing, lots of you are saying, well, what's the solution to this problem? And Griesbach's solution was this one, that Mark had actually pulled together bits from Matthew and Luke to create his own new gospel. So Mark becomes the middle term because Mark has deliberately, effectively made it into the middle term by conflating. Now, this theory was quite influential for quite a long time, all the way through probably at least to the middle 19th century. Griesbach is like 1770s, like I was saying, so quite a while into the middle of the 19th century. But then what happens is the persuasiveness just begins to kind of drop away of Griesbach as a new theory comes into the ascendant called the two-source theory. The two-source theory is based on the priority of Mark, the idea that Matthew and Luke copy Mark, plus one extra thing, a document called Q, which has been lost, which I've already alluded to. And for many years, the two-source theory just reigned supreme in the Guild, up to the point where a German scholar called Willy Marxsen, M-A-R-X-S-E-N, Willy Marxsen, said in the late 1950s, the two-source theory is now so assured as a result of scholarship that we can stop using the term hypothesis at all. It's an assured result of scholarship. That was how confident he was. Never ever make comments that are as confident as that, because what will happen is, quickly, someone will come along and kick you in the backside and prove you wrong. And that's what happened with Marxsen, because not long after he said that, an American scholar called William Farmer, 1964, wrote a book on the Synoptic Problem, in which he revived this Griesbach hypothesis. As the years went on, Farmer and those that followed him decided that they disliked the term Griesbach hypothesis, wonder why, and they decided to call it instead the two-gospel hypothesis. And the idea of the two-gospel hypothesis was that Matthew and Luke were the two gospels that supplied Mark with his gospel. So they tried to, if you like, mirror the language of the two-source theory by saying the two-gospel theory. I must admit, I dislike very much the term two-gospel theory, because the term, there's three gospels, right? It should be the two gospels as source theory. The two-gospel theory, I think it's a problematic title. And what's more, as we'll come on to see, there is another theory, the one called the Farrer theory, which is also in its own way a two-gospel theory, because on that theory, Matthew and Mark provide the main sources for Luke, so that's a two-gospel theory as well. So Griesbach theory is revived in 1964. It still has some advocates in America. One of the most prominent is someone called David Peabody, who we'll look at a bit next time, and we'll explore what's going on there. Okay, I think we're ready to pack up now. So any thoughts, worries, questions about the midterm, let us have them via email or IM.
Well, that's the end of the first of these 3 extra extended episodes of the NT Pod on the Synoptic Problem, which are recordings from my classes here at Duke. Your comments are gratefully received, and I hope to be back again soon with another one of these extended episodes, and of course with the normal episodes of the NT Pod. For all things related to the pod, you can go to podacre.blogspot.com.